There are some shipwrecks that are more unique than others, perhaps because of good preservation, like the Deepwater American wrecks in the Pacific, or maybe because of the ship's design, like the I-400 class submarine. And then there's HMS Victoria, the topic of today's video, which has both an interesting design and an interesting orientation. This is one of a handful of shipwrecks that came to rest vertically on the bottom. And I mean that quite literally, as Victoria's bow is buried, while the stern is pointing straight up towards the surface. I have covered this wreck before, although that was in one of the overarching, multiple shipwrecks in one video. This time we'll look at Victoria in much greater detail, starting, of course, with the sinking itself. This occurred on June 22nd, 1893. On that day, Victoria was sailing with the Mediterranean fleet. At the time, it was performing a standard exercise, especially for this fleet, which under Admiral George Tryon had common training exercises. This one began much like the others. Tryon split his fleet into two columns. He would lead 6 ships in Victoria. Across from this group, the second column consisted of 5 ships. This was led by his deputy, Albert Markham, in the older HMS Camperdown. The goal was the 2 squadrons, off the coast of Lebanon, turning inwards towards each other. This would see the formation reverse course while ending up alongside each other. A fairly standard maneuver. Tryon, however, made a change that, reportedly, caused great unease among his officers. With the turning circles of the ships taken into account, a distance of around 2,000 yards was considered the minimum safe distance. Because Admiral Tryon wanted the ships to close to within 400 yards of each other at their closest in the turn. You would want a good margin of safety, taking into account turning radius, to make sure the ships didn't collide. Thus, 2,000 yards. Or, if a closer turn had to be made, at least 1,600 yards. Tryon wanted a much, much closer turn, as close together as 1,100 yards when starting the maneuver. Exactly what he was intending here has been debated to this day. As the squadrons made their turn, it almost immediately became apparent that things were going wrong. Aboard Camperdown, Admiral Markham delayed the turn as long as he could, desperately hoping that Tryon would change his orders, until he received a signal basically saying, "What are you waiting for?" Camperdown made the turn, and aboard both battleships, the commanders realized what was going to happen. However, Tryon waited. Only at the very last moment did he order go astern. By then, it was too late. Camperdown's ram bow slammed into Victoria's side. That ram did its job, perhaps too well. Victoria began flooding rapidly as Camperdown pulled out and away. With the massive hole in the side, things were bad enough. However, in a similar manner to Britannic decades later, many hatches and portholes were open to cool down the ship on a hot summer day. That let in even more water. Victoria, as designed, already had a low freeboard. This was necessitated by a massively heavy turret that carried 2 equally heavy 16.25-inch guns. This had led to a humorous nickname of the Slipper, because of the low freeboard and the high aft superstructure, as well as a tendency to be very wet towards the bow. Now that heavy turret was only dragging the ship down quicker. This worsened the flooding. In the end, Victoria would capsize and sink in just 13 to 15 minutes. With her props still rotating, the ship went down bow first. 358 men were lost with the battleship, mostly men in the engine rooms who never received an order to abandon ship. Tryon himself went down with his flagship. As Victoria sank, her heavy bow and still turning shafts drove her straight down. Even when a ship sinks by the bow, it generally does so gradually. Victoria seems to have gone down like an arrow, driving her bow 30 meters, or around 100 feet, into the bottom. This resulted in the situation the wreck was found in 111 years after she sank. On August 22, 2004, Victoria's wreck was located by Christian Francis and Mark Elliott. They found a wreck that is decently well preserved for being underwater over a century. Despite being fairly shallow, the ship hasn't fallen apart to any notable extent. She remains pointing straight up, resting at a depth of 140 meters, or 460 feet. The wreck is deep, but not out of reach for experienced divers, especially with that unique orientation. It is easier to reach the stern than it otherwise would be in this regard, even with 30 meters of the bow buried in the mud. With all of that out of the way, though, let's look at the wreck now. The first thing any diver will see when descending upon Victoria is the extreme stern. This is rusty, but generally recognizable, right down to the nameplate here. This has been eroded away, yet the name Victoria is still legible. From a distance, it's harder to make out. Even from closer in, it's still obscured by the metal around it. However, when you close in further, it becomes far easier to see, and the reason for its preservation becomes apparent for that matter. This was not merely painted on the stern. It was fixed in place, raised letters sticking out from the hull, and those remain in place, stark white sticking out from the duller metal around them. There was no doubt which ship this was, of course, but this would have been confirmation if there was. In the same way it was on deepwater wrecks in the Pacific, finding the name of a ship was the final confirmation anyone needed, and it's a fitting first sight when diving on Victoria's wreck. However, just a bit above the nameplate, we have another interesting feature. This is the stern gallery, which has an entrance right here. The wooden framework around that entrance, seen here on the surface, is long gone. It would have rotted away long ago if it wasn't torn off in the sinking. In any event, that doorway leads into the ship. It's likely the easiest entry point inside, although it takes a braver person than me to think about doing that. Victoria is old, and I doubt her orientation has done the interior many favors. Nonetheless, we have views inside her here. I will, of course, link to the full video these came from. As we look at this, the ship's unique position is immediately apparent. What was once laying flat on the surface is now angled up. A doorway here is resting on its side. The ceiling remains in place with this opening here, but it's now angled. The floor, meanwhile, has rusted away to expose the framework of the ship. Despite that, the level of preservation remains impressive. For over a century beneath the waves, Victoria shows relatively minimal rusting. Yes, the floor is down to the frames, but the rest is still pretty much intact. Probably because this is the interior of the wreck, where it has been less exposed to the elements. Because, looking at a different video, which I will also link in the description, things are less pretty. It's apparent that the deck here has mostly rotted away. The wood is gone, and the frames are showing serious rusting. That the capstan here is still present is honestly surprising. I imagine the steel there is more reinforced, so it has lasted better, but the point remains. It's impressive it hasn't fallen off. More impressive, perhaps, is this hatch opening. While the hatch itself has vanished, the entrance remains, even as the wood and metal falls away around it. It remains an opening into the ship with what looks like railing here, and maybe some remnant of wood here. This area does look over a century old, but even so, it still has areas that are decently intact. But, all of that said, neither of the other pictures are quite as distinctive as this one. One of the smaller guns still resting on the deck. Like the capstan earlier, I imagine this area is more reinforced. Even so, the deck is still there, and the gun hasn't fallen away. The fittings holding it in place certainly held up, to say the least. The same goes for the secondary 10-inch gun at the stern. This mounting remains in place, pointing towards the surface. It hasn't shifted or fallen at all, and while there is visible rusting, like here, it's still mostly intact. It's also the largest gun easily visible on the wreck. The bow turret is at the ocean floor and much deeper down. There's also a third gun seen here that is one of the most common pictures of the wreck. While completely coated in sea life, it's also still in place. You can even see the path it rotated on here. This is likely one of the 12 6-inch secondary guns, and from the wheel to the gun shield is still basically all here. That said, just one more internal picture, that being some dishes buried in silt. Considering how fast the ship went down, I didn't expect to see something like this. Dishes maybe, but not a pile that seems right off Titanic. With the internal shots done though, we can now look at the more famous pictures. The massive props still pointing to the surface. These have been photographed from various angles and from various distances. Sometimes just the props, sometimes including the rudder. Like here, which was the thumbnail for the last time I covered this wreck. This image, on the other hand, is much more striking. A view from below, looking towards the surface. You can see the two props frozen in place when they finally came to a halt, and the rudder, which seems to be slightly turned to the side. The two divers in frame also give a good sense of scale. While no dreadnought, or even pre-dreadnought, Victoria is still a large ship for her time. The second to last picture of the wreck itself also demonstrates this. The diver, while not next to the shaft, still shows how large it is, as well as the fact the mounting hasn't broken. The shaft and its prop, or screw, is still right where it was installed. A closer in look here rounds off our look at the wreck. Here you can see the pattern of corrosion on the prop itself, as well as netting tangled across it. While nowhere near as bad as North Sea wrecks, Victoria does have a decent amount of fishing net on her hulk. Enough to be dangerous, though not enough to completely cover the wreck, like the similarly vertical Rusalka. In any case, though, this is the last picture of the wreck itself. To round off the video at this point, I'll use a model and a painting. There's no sonar, so these are the best looks at the wreck as a whole. The model is, of course, pretty well known. You've probably seen it before, even if you weren't specifically looking for Victoria's wreck. It shows the ship's vertical angle, as well as the shape of the hull. This model is done up to present the vessel as she was when the hulk hit the bottom. All the railing and paint still intact. It's a good demonstration of how Victoria ended up. The painting, on the other hand, is more of a look at the ship as she is now, or at least, well after she sank. Much of the railing is gone, the deck is falling apart, and the paint has long since faded. The nets I mentioned earlier are strewn over the ship, while a diver gives the sense of scale. It seems a fitting image to end on, really, as a reminder of Victoria's condition. A gravestone to 358 men who didn't need to die on that sunny June day in 1893. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.